They say your past always catches up to you. I just never figured it would be in the form of flesh, hungry ghouls clawing at the doors of my pathetic excuse for a safe house. My name is Jake, Razor, Riley. Razor, because I have a knack for slipping out of tight spots, leaving a trail of, well, let's just say unresolved issues in my wake. Issues that landed me on the FBI's most wanted list, right there. Sandwiched between a suspected eco-terrorist and some Wall Street shark who embezzled enough money to buy a small country. Funny how the world changes, isn't it? 1 minute, you're public enemy number 1. The next, you're just another piece of potential protein in the grand, horrifying food chain. Ironic, really. I spent years running from the law, always looking over my shoulder for the flashing blue and red lights. Now, the only lights I'm worried about are the flickering, primal hunger in the eyes of the changed, the infected, the goddamn zombies. It all started so fast. 1 minute, the news was buzzing about some flu strain originating overseas. Nothing too alarming. The next, it was here, ripping through the population like a wildfire through dry brush. They called it the Crimson Flu, initially. Then, the reports started coming in. Bizarre behavior, aggression, people attacking each other. The authorities tried to downplay it, of course. Said it was mass hysteria, some kind of psychosomatic reaction to the stress of a new pandemic. They were dead wrong. Literally. I was holed up in a forgotten corner of rural West Virginia when it hit. A cabin deep in the woods. The kind that hasn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the Carter administration. It was my go to when things got too hot. A place where the only neighbors were the squirrels and the occasional grumpy black bear. I had a generator, enough canned goods to last a few weeks if I rationed, and a healthy collection of, let's call them, tools of my former trade. Things you acquire when you make a living dancing on the wrong side of the law. The first sign that something was seriously wrong was the silence. The woods are never truly silent. There's always the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant drone of insects. But then, it was like someone had flipped a switch. Dead, quiet. It was more unsettling than any gunshot I'd ever heard. Then came the screams. Distant at first, carried on the wind. They were raw, primal, filled with a terror went beyond anything I'd ever witnessed. Even the recordings from crime scenes I'd seen in my then legal endeavors didn't capture this level of pure, unadulterated horror. These weren't the screams of someone being robbed or even murdered in a fit of rage. These were the cries of prey being torn apart. Curiosity, or maybe just a death wish, got the better of me. I cautiously approached a window, peering through a gap in the dusty curtains. The woods near the edge of the property were still, but then I saw it. A figure stumbling out of the tree line. At first, I thought it was just some drunk idiot who'd lost his way. But as it got closer, I saw the jerky, unnatural movements. The way its head lolled to the side at an impossible angle. The tattered clothes ripped and stained with what looked horrifyingly like blood. And then I saw its face, or what was left of it. The skin was gray and decaying, stretched taut over sharp bone. The eyes were vacant, milky white, yet somehow fixed on something unseen. Its mouth hung open in a silent snarl, revealing rows of yellowed, jagged teeth. It shuffled forward with an uneven gait, its arms outstretched as if reaching for something. Then another one emerged from the trees, and another. Soon, there were half a dozen of them, moaning and groaning with a sound that scraped at my sanity. They weren't moving fast, but there was a relentless quality to their advance that sent a chill down my spine, colder than any winter night I'd spent on the run. I scrambled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Zombie. The word echoed in my mind, a ridiculous concept ripped straight from the pages of some cheap horror novel. But there was no denying what I had just seen. The world, it seemed, had gone completely and utterly mad. My first instinct was to run, to grab my bag and disappear back into the anonymity of the wilderness. But where would I go? The screams were getting closer, more frequent. Whatever was happening out there, it wasn't localized. This was widespread. Besides, running had been my default for too long. Maybe, just maybe, this was my chance for a different kind of escape. An escape from the man I'd been, the life I'd lived. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking. The desperate attempt of a cornered animal to find some semblance of meaning in the face of oblivion. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. Panic wouldn't help me now. I needed to think, to strategize. Survival, in any situation, came down to two things: resources and adaptability. My cabin wasn't exactly Fort Knox, but it had its advantages. It was isolated, for one. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away, and judging by the increasing volume of the moans, they were probably already indisposed. The walls were thick log, sturdy enough to keep out most wildlife, and hopefully, these things. The windows were small and could be easily barricaded. My resources were decent. I had about a week's worth of non-perishable food, mostly canned beans, soup, and enough jerky to choke a horse. Water was more of a concern. I had a few gallons stored, but the well outside would eventually become a necessity. That was a task I definitely wasn't looking forward to. And then there were my tools. A couple of handguns, a shotgun with a decent supply of shells, and a few knives, each with its own history. Nothing fancy, but enough to make things interesting for anyone who decided to try and force their way in. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. I boarded up the windows with spare planks of wood I found in the shed, reinforcing them with whatever furniture I could move. The front door, a solid oak thing, got the same treatment. Barricaded from the inside with a heavy dresser and a couple of sturdy chairs. The sounds outside were getting worse. The moans were closer now, accompanied by the sickening thud of something heavy hitting the cabin walls. I risked another peek through a small crack in the boarded-up window. The yard was swarming with them. Dozens of the infected, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, but their hunger palpable. One of them spotted the crack in the window and lurched towards it, its rotting hand slamming against the wood. The impact made me jump, and I could hear the scraping of its fingernails against the wood. It was a horrifying sound, primal and desperate. I knew this wouldn't hold forever. They were relentless, and there were too many of them. But it would buy me time. Time to figure out my next move. Time to maybe even find some way out of this nightmare. The first night was the worst. The sounds never stopped. The constant moaning, the scraping, the occasional heavy thud against the walls. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside sent my heart racing. Spent the night huddled in a corner, shotgun in hand, my senses on high alert. By morning, the initial wave seemed to have subsided slightly. The number of infected in the yard had thinned out, though they were still out there, lurking in the shadows of the trees. It was time to take stock, to assess the situation and plan my next move. My immediate priorities were water and information. My stored water wouldn't last long, and I had no idea what was happening beyond the confines of my little cabin in the woods. Was this just a local outbreak? Or had the world truly gone to hell? Gathering my courage, I decided to risk a quick foray outside. I needed to check the well and see if I could scavenge any supplies from the shed. I strapped on my sidearm, grabbed a sturdy knife, and took a deep breath before unbarricading the front door, just enough to slip through. The scene that greeted me was unsettlingly calm. The yard was littered with debris, fallen leaves, broken branches, and something else. Something that looked suspiciously like pieces of torn clothing and patches of blood. The air hung heavy with a strange, metallic scent that made my stomach churn. The infected were still around, but they seemed less concentrated than before. A few shuffled aimlessly near the edge of the woods, their moans weak and listless. Maybe they had moved on, or maybe they were just taking a break before their next feeding frenzy. I made my way quickly to the well, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. The well looked untouched, thankfully. The water was still clear. I used a bucket to draw up a few gallons, carefully storing them in empty containers I had inside. Next, the shed. It was a rickety wooden structure, barely held together by years of neglect. I cautiously opened the door, my shotgun raised. It was empty, save for some gardening tools and a rusty lawnmower. No extra supplies, no hidden stash of weaponry, just junk. As I turned to head back to the cabin, I heard it. A new sound. Not the moaning of the infected, but something else. Something human, a sob, faint but distinct, carried on the morning air. My hand instinctively tightened on the grip of my shotgun. Was it a survivor? Or a trap? Either way, I knew I had to investigate. The razor in me, the one that never backed down from a challenge, wouldn't let me ignore it. I moved slowly and silently towards the sound, my eyes scanning the trees. The sob came again, closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the road, the only path leading to my secluded little piece of paradise. Cautiously, I made my way to the edge of the property, peering through the dense foliage. And then I saw her. A young woman, huddled on the side of the road, her face buried in her hands. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking with each sob. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and there was a smear of blood on her arm. My first instinct was caution. This could be a trap. Maybe she was infected, or maybe she was bait to lure an unsuspecting prey. But something about her vulnerability, the sheer desperation in her sobs, made me hesitate. "Hey!" I called out, my voice low but firm. The woman flinched and looked up, her eyes wide with terror. They were red-rimmed and swollen from crying, and her face was pale and streaked with dirt. But she didn't look infected. Not yet, anyway. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. This was it. The first real choice I had to make in this new, terrifying world. Could I trust her? Could I afford not to? The odds were already stacked against me. But leaving her out there alone, that felt wrong, even for someone like me. "Get up," I said, motioning for her to come towards the cabin. Quickly. She didn't hesitate. Scrambling to her feet, she stumbled towards me, her eyes darting nervously around the woods. I kept my shotgun raised, my gaze fixed on the surrounding trees, ready for anything. We made it back to the cabin without incident. I quickly ushered her inside and re-barricaded the door. She stood there, trembling, her eyes still wide with fear as she took in the cramped, dimly lit interior of the cabin. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for helping me." "What's your name?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Sarah," she replied. "My name is Sarah Miller." "Jake Riley," I said. "Now, Sarah Miller, tell me what happened." And so she did. Her story was much the same as what I had pieced together. The flu, the bizarre behavior, the attacks. She had been traveling with her family when it happened. They were caught on the road, overrun by the infected. She was the only one who made it out alive. As she spoke, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just some isolated incident. This was the end of the world as we knew it. And somehow Jake, Razor, Riley, a man who had spent his life running from the law, was now faced with the daunting task of surviving the apocalypse. And I wasn't alone anymore. For better or for worse, I had company. And in this new world, company could be either your greatest strength or your deadliest weakness. Only time would tell which one Sarah Miller would be. But one thing was for sure, the first 24 hours were over. The nightmare had just begun. Sarah's story was a grim echo of the chaos I'd witnessed, amplified by the personal tragedy of losing her family. As she recounted the horrific scenes on the highway, the sudden, brutal attacks, and the overwhelming numbers of the infected, the color drained further from her already pale face. I listened in silence, my initial suspicion slowly giving way to a reluctant empathy. I'd seen my share of bad things, done my share too, but the raw terror in her eyes felt genuine. Once she finished, a heavy silence settled over the cabin. The sounds outside were still there, the distant moans, the occasional shuffling, a constant reminder of the nightmare unfolding beyond our walls. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, a weight pressing down on us both. I looked around the small cabin, my mind racing. We had limited supplies, and our sanctuary, as sturdy as it was, wouldn't hold forever. We needed a plan, and we needed it fast. First, I said, breaking the silence, we need to secure this place. Make it as defensible as possible. Sarah nodded, her fear momentarily overshadowed by a flicker of determination. We spent the next few hours reinforcing the cabin. We moved more furniture against the doors and windows, creating makeshift barricades. I showed Sarah how to use the shotgun, explaining the basics of loading and firing. She was hesitant at first, her hands trembling as she held the weapon, but the fear of what was outside seemed to give her a grim resolve. "Can you shoot?" I asked. "My dad, he taught me a little," she said. "For self-defense." "Good enough," I replied. "In this world, every bit helps." As the day wore on, the sounds outside seemed to intensify. The infected were becoming more active, their moans louder, more insistent. We took turns watching through the cracks in the boarded up windows, our nerves stretched taut. They're trying to get in," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear as she watched a group of the infected clawing at the front door. "They're stupid," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "They just keep banging. They don't have the brains to figure out how to open a door." But even as I said the words, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. They might be mindless, but there were so many of them. Sheer numbers could eventually overwhelm our defenses. We needed a way out. A long-term plan. This cabin was a temporary reprieve, not a sustainable solution. But where could we go? Every news report, every terrified whisper Sarah had overheard before finding me, painted a picture of widespread chaos. Cities were overrun, roads were blocked, and the military, if it even still existed in any coherent form, was nowhere to be seen. "We need to find other survivors," Sarah said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "Maybe there are other people who haven't been changed." I considered the possibility. It was a long shot, but it was better than just waiting here to be devoured. But finding survivors meant venturing out into the infected world, a prospect that filled me with dread. "We need supplies first," I said. "Food, water, medicine. We don't have enough here to last long." The nearest town was about 10 miles away. Before all this happened, it was a sleepy little place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Now, I could only imagine the horrors that awaited us there. But we had no choice. Staying here meant a slow, inevitable death. Going out there was a risk, a huge one, but it offered a glimmer of hope. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the cabin, we started to prepare. I gathered my weapons, checking each one to make sure it was ready. Sarah rummaged through the meager supplies, packing what little food and water we had into a couple of backpacks she'd found in the cabin's closet. "We should leave at first light," I said. "That gives us the best chance of making it to town before they become too active." Sarah nodded in agreement. We spent the rest of the night in tense silence, taking turns to watch and listen. Every moan, every rustle outside sent shivers down our spines. Sleep was fitful and plagued by nightmares. The first rays of dawn crept through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, painting stripes of pale light across the dusty floor. It was time to go. I took a deep breath, trying to quell the fear that gnawed at me. This was it. The next step into the unknown. I carefully unbarricaded the front door, just enough to peek outside. The yard was still, the early morning air cool and crisp. The infected seemed less active, their movements sluggish. It was our chance. Ready? I asked Sarah, my hand resting on the grip of my shotgun. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. We slipped out of the cabin, moving quickly and quietly through the yard. The silence of the woods was still unsettling, broken only by the occasional distant moan. We kept to the trees, using the cover of the foliage to stay hidden. As we approached the road, the signs of the apocalypse became more evident. Abandoned cars littered the asphalt, some with their doors open, others crashed into the trees. There was an eerie stillness to the scene, a silence that spoke volumes of the terror that had unfolded here. We moved cautiously along the side of the road, our eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves sent us scrambling for cover. It wasn't long before we encountered our first infected. It was a man, still wearing his work uniform, his face a grotesque mask of decay. He was shuffling aimlessly down the middle of the road, moaning softly. I raised my shotgun, ready to fire, but Sarah put a hand on my arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Maybe we can just go around him." We carefully moved off the road, keeping a wide berth as we passed the infected. He didn't seem to notice us, his attention fixed on some unseen horror in the distance. As we continued towards town, we encountered more of them. Some were alone, others in small groups. We managed to avoid most of them, using stealth and the cover of the trees. But the closer we got to town, the more frequent and active they became. The outskirts of town were a scene of utter devastation. Buildings were damaged, some burned to the ground. Cars were overturned and smashed, and everywhere there were the infected. They roamed the streets in packs, their moans echoing through the deserted town. This is worse than I imagined," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I had to agree. I'd seen some bad things in my life, but this was on a whole different level. This was true horror. "We need to find a place to scavenge for supplies," I said, trying to sound decisive. "Something small, like a pharmacy or a grocery store." We moved cautiously down the main street, sticking close to the walls of the buildings, our senses on high alert. The silence of the town was broken only by the moaning of the infected and the crunch of our boots on the debris-strewn pavement. Suddenly, we heard a scream. It came from inside one of the buildings, a small grocery store that looked relatively intact. "Someone's in there," Sarah said, her eyes wide with alarm. My instincts screamed at me to run, to avoid any unnecessary contact. But the raw terror in that scream tugged at something inside me, something I thought I had buried long ago. "Stay here," I said to Sarah. "Keep watch." I cautiously approached the grocery store, my shotgun raised. The front door was slightly ajar. I could hear more screams coming from inside, mixed with the guttural moans of the infected. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene that greeted me was a nightmare. A woman was pinned against a shelf by two of the infected, their decaying faces inches from hers. Another infected lay motionless on the floor, its head twisted at an unnatural angle. Without hesitation, I raised my shotgun and fired. The blast echoed through the store, and the two infected attacking the woman collapsed to the floor. The woman screamed again, this time in relief. She scrambled away from the dead infected, her eyes fixed on me with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for saving me. Are you all right?" I asked, my eyes scanning the store for any other threats. I think so," she said, her voice trembling. They just came out of nowhere." Just then, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around, my shotgun raised, to see another infected lurching towards me from the back of the store. There was no time to aim. I fired from the hip, the blast catching the infected in the chest. It stumbled back and fell, its lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. "We need to get out of here," I said to the woman. "It's not safe." "My son," she cried. "He's still here. He's hiding in the back." Without hesitation, I motioned for her to lead the way. We cautiously made our way through the aisles, stepping over the bodies of the dead infected. The store was a mess, shelves overturned, food scattered across the floor. We found the woman's son hiding in a small office at the back of the store. He was a young boy, no more than 10 years old, his face pale and tear-streaked. "Mummy!" he cried, running to her arms. "We need to go," I said, my voice urgent. "Now." We made our way back to the front of the store, our eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement. Sarah was waiting outside, her face etched with worry. "We found them," I said. "We need to get out of here." We moved quickly down the street, the woman and her son clinging to us. We needed to find a safe place, somewhere to regroup and plan our next move. The town was too dangerous, overrun with the infected. We needed to find somewhere more isolated, somewhere we could defend. As we reached the edge of town, I spotted it. A small, isolated farmhouse, set back from the road and surrounded by fields. It looked deserted, but it offered a glimmer of hope. A potential sanctuary. "That way," I said, pointing towards the farmhouse. "Let's make a run for it." We sprinted across the open field, the moans of the infected in town fading behind us. We reached the farmhouse, its porch weathered and worn, its windows dark and empty. I cautiously approached the front door and tried the handle. It was unlocked. I exchanged a look with Sarah and the woman. This could be our chance. A new beginning, perhaps. Or just another temporary reprieve in the face of the relentless horror that had become our world. But for now, it was shelter. And in this new world, shelter was a precious commodity. The first 24 hours had taught me that much. And somehow, I had a feeling the next 24 were going to be even worse. The farmhouse was eerily silent. Dust motes danced in the faint light, filtering through the grimy windows. giving the interior a ghostly feel. It was clear that the occupants had left in a hurry. Dishes were still on the table, half-eaten meals gone cold. Clothes lay scattered on the floor of the bedrooms. It was like a snapshot of a life abruptly interrupted, a chilling reminder of the swiftness and totality of the outbreak. Emily, the woman from the grocery store, clung tightly to her son, Thomas. Her eyes darted nervously around the living room, as if expecting the infected to burst through the door at any moment. Do you think anyone will come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I doubt it," I said, my gaze sweeping across the room, assessing potential threats and escape routes. They wouldn't leave food like this if they planned on returning. I moved to the windows, carefully peering through the gaps in the curtains. The surrounding fields stretched out to the horizon, empty and still. There was no sign of life, infected or otherwise. For now, it seemed we were alone. "We need to secure this place," I said, echoing my earlier words in the cabin. Same drill. Barricade the doors and windows. We set to work, moving furniture, finding spare pieces of wood in the barn to reinforce the entrances. Thomas, despite his fear, helped where he could, carrying smaller items and keeping close to his mother. Sarah and Emily worked together, their shared trauma forging a silent bond between them. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. This farmhouse felt too exposed, too far from any real source of supplies. But for now, it was better than being out in the open. Once the house was as secure as we could make it, we took stock of our resources. The pantry held some canned goods, vegetables, soup, a few jars of fruit. There was a decent supply of bottled water, thankfully. In the fridge, long since powerless, the remnants of spoiled food emitted a stomach-churning stench. We quickly disposed of it outside, careful to avoid attracting any unwanted attention. "This will last us a few days, maybe a week if we're careful," I said, surveying our meager haul. "But we need to find more. Where will we go?" Emily asked, her voice filled with worry. I didn't have an answer. The nearest town was overrun. The roads were likely crawling with the infected. Traveling any significant distance felt like a death sentence. "Maybe there are other farms around here," Sarah suggested. "We could try to find supplies at another place." It was a possibility, albeit a risky one. We had no idea what we might encounter out there. As night fell, the familiar sounds of the apocalypse began to filter through the barricaded windows. The moans of the infected, though distant, were a constant reminder of the danger that lurked outside. We took turns keeping watch, huddled together in the dimly lit living room. Emily and Thomas slept fitfully, their exhaustion finally overcoming their fear. Sarah and I stayed awake, our nerves on edge, listening to the sounds outside. "What do you think happened?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How did this happen so fast?" "I don't know," I admitted. One minute everything was normal, the next, I trailed off, unable to find the words to describe the sheer insanity of the situation. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the world pressing down on us. The flickering light of a single battery, powered lantern cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, making the familiar room seem alien and threatening. "I used to watch these kinds of movies," said softly. "Zombie movies. I never thought it could actually happen." "Me neither," I replied. "I always figured if the world ended, it would be with a bang, not a moan." A faint smile flickered across Sarah's lips at my morbid humor. It was a brief moment of levity in the midst of the overwhelming darkness. As the night wore on, the sounds outside seemed to shift. The moans were still there, but there was something else now. A new sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a sort of clicking, chittering noise, almost insect-like, but far more sinister. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Sarah, nudging her awake. She listened intently, her eyes widening with fear. We moved cautiously to one of the windows, peering through a small crack in the boards. The darkness outside was almost absolute. But as our eyes adjusted, we began to make out shapes moving in the fields. They were smaller than the typical infected we'd seen, their movements quicker, more erratic. And they made that awful clicking sound. "I don't like the look of those," I muttered, my hand instinctively reaching for my shotgun. Suddenly, one of the creatures lunged against the window, its grotesque face pressed against the glass, its sharp, needle-like teeth snapping. The clicking sound was even more horrifying up close. Sarah gasped and stumbled back, her face pale with terror. "What are they?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. "But they're fast. And they seem smarter." The creatures continued to claw and snap at the windows, their numbers growing. It was clear that our barricades wouldn't hold them for long. "We need to move," I said, my voice urgent. "Now." We quickly woke Emily and Thomas, explaining the new threat. Panic flickered in Emily's eyes, but she managed to keep her composure for her son's sake. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know yet," I said. "But we can't stay here." I grabbed my shotgun and as much ammunition as I could carry. Sarah and Emily did the same, gathering what few supplies we had managed to collect. Thomas clung tightly to his mother, his small face pale and frightened. We moved to the back of the house, hoping to avoid the creatures at the front. The back door was also barricaded, but I managed to pry it open enough for us to squeeze through. We found ourselves in the backyard shrouded in darkness. The clicking sounds were still audible, but they seemed to be concentrated at the front of the house. "We need to get to the barn," I whispered. "Maybe we can find something there." We moved quickly across the yard, keeping low to the ground. The barn loomed ahead of us, a dark and ominous silhouette against the night sky. I cautiously pushed open the barn door, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was filled with the smell of hay and dust. It was dark, but I could make out the shapes of farm equipment and tools. "Stay close," I whispered, leading the way inside. As we moved deeper into the barn, I heard a rustling sound from the loft above. I froze, my shotgun raised. "Who's there?" I called out. Silence. Then, a figure dropped down from the loft, landing silently on the hay-covered floor. It was a man, his face hidden in the shadows. He was holding a rifle. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough and wary. "We're survivors," I said, keeping my weapon trained on him. "We were taking shelter in the farmhouse." The man lowered his rifle slightly, his eyes still narrowed with suspicion. "There were others at the farmhouse." "Just us," I said. "Me, these 2 women, and the boy." The man stepped forward into the dim light, and I could see his face more clearly. He was older, his face weathered and lined. He had a long, unkempt beard, and his eyes were hard and watchful. "My name is Silas," he said. "I've been living in the loft." "Jake," I replied. "This is Sarah, Emily, and Thomas." Silas nodded curtly. "Heard some commotion at the house. Didn't know what it was." "There are new kinds of infected," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Smaller, faster. They make a clicking sound." Silas's eyes widened slightly. "Clickers. I've heard stories. Haven't seen any myself," I said, tearing it apart. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice filled with panic. "There's a storm cellar behind the barn," Silas said. "It's small, but it'll offer shelter." We followed Silas to the back of the barn, where he pulled open a heavy wooden door, concealed in the floor. A narrow staircase led down into the darkness. "Go on," Silas said, gesturing for us to descend. "I'll bring up the rear." We carefully made our way down the steps, the air growing cooler and damper with each step. The storm cellar was small and cramped, with stone walls and a dirt floor. It was filled with old farming equipment and boxes. Once we were all inside, Silas closed and bolted the heavy door. The darkness was complete, save for the faint beam of a flashlight Silas produced from his pocket. "It's not much," he said, shining the light around the small space. "But it's better than being out there." We huddled together in the darkness, the silence of the storm cellar a stark contrast to the horrors we had just escaped. For the moment, we were safe. But the clicking sounds, though fainter now, were still audible above, a chilling reminder that the nightmare was far from over. The second 24 hours had brought new, terrifying threats, and I had a feeling that our refuge in the storm cellar was only temporary. We needed a real plan, a way to survive in this increasingly hostile world. And with these new, nightmarish creatures on the prowl, I knew that whatever came next would be even more dangerous than anything we had faced so far. The storm cellar was a claustrophobic space, the silence punctuated only by the occasional nervous cough or the distant, muffled clicking from above. Silas, despite his initial gruffness, seemed to possess a quiet competence that was strangely reassuring. He checked the heavy wooden door frequently, his weathered face etched with concern. "They're still up there," he'd say, his voice low. "Sound like a whole damn swarm." The hours crawled by. The air in the cellar grew stale and heavy, the darkness broken only by the narrow beam of Silas's flashlight, which he used sparingly to conserve the batteries. Emily did her best to keep Thomas occupied, whispering stories and drawing pictures on the dusty floor with a stick. Sarah sat beside me, her hand occasionally brushing against mine, a silent offering of comfort in the oppressive darkness. "What's the plan, Jake?" Sarah finally asked, breaking the long silence. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Honestly, I don't have one. We're stuck down here until those things clear out. Then, we figure out our next move." "We can't stay here forever," Silas said, his voice firm. "This cellar won't hold if they get determined enough." He was right. The door was sturdy, but it was just wood. Those clicking creatures sounded relentless. "Do you know this area well, Silas?" I asked. "Lived around here my whole life," he replied. "Know these woods like the back of my hand. Are there any other settlements nearby? Anywhere safer?" Silas hesitated. "There's a small community about 20 miles west of here. Used to be a logging camp. They built some cabins, had a few families living there. It's pretty isolated." A glimmer of hope sparked within me. A community, other survivors. It was a long shot, but it was the first real lead we'd had. "Think we can make it there?" I asked. Silas shrugged. "It'll be a hell of a trek. Roads are probably blocked. We'd have to go through the woods. And with those clickers around." He didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood the risks. But the thought of reaching a place with other people, a place that might offer some semblance of safety, was too tempting to ignore. "We have to try," Emily said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I can't stay down here, waiting for those things to eat us." As if in response, a series of frantic clicks and scratches echoed from directly above us. The wooden door shuddered under the force of whatever was attacking it. "They know we're here," Silas said grimly. "We need to move. Now." He pushed open the cellar door just a crack, peering out into the barn. "Looks clear for now, but we need to be fast." We scrambled out of the storm cellar, our senses on high alert. The barn was eerily silent, the only evidence of the creature's presence being a few scratches on the cellar door. Silas led the way to a back exit of the barn, a small, rarely used door hidden behind a stack of hay bales. He carefully unlatched it and peeked outside. "Coast is clear," he whispered. "Let's go." We slipped out of the barn and into the dense woods behind it. The darkness was thick, the only light filtering through the dense canopy of trees from the sliver of moon above. The air was damp and cool, filled with the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. And somewhere, not too far away, we could still hear the faint, chilling clicks. Silas moved with a quiet confidence, navigating the uneven terrain with ease. He knew the woods, every twist and turn, every fallen log and hidden ravine. We followed close behind, our footsteps muffled by the soft earth and fallen leaves. Thomas, despite his fear, kept up remarkably well, his small hand tightly clasped in his mother's. Sarah walked beside me, her presence a silent source of strength. We walked for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in on us, the silence broken only by our ragged breaths and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The threat of the infected, especially the new, terrifying clickers, hung heavy in the air. Just as exhaustion began to set in, Silas stopped. "We'll rest here for a bit," he whispered, pointing to a small clearing. We collapsed onto the soft grass, our bodies aching with fatigue. Silas kept watch, his rifle held at the ready. "How much further do you think it is?" I asked him. "Hard to say in the dark," he replied. "But if we keep moving at dawn, we should reach the logging camp sometime tomorrow evening." Tomorrow evening. It felt like a lifetime away. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, we set off again. The woods were different in the daylight, the shadows less menacing, the path ahead clearer. But the sounds were also more prevalent. The moans of the regular infected were more frequent, and we had a couple of close calls, having to duck and hide as small groups of them stumbled through the trees. Around midday, we encountered them, the clickers. We were crossing a shallow stream when we heard the unmistakable clicking sound. It was closer now, more insistent. Silas immediately motioned for us to stop. "Get down," he whispered, pushing us towards the ground. We huddled behind a thicket of bushes, peering through the leaves. 3 of the creatures emerged from the trees, their jerky movements even more disturbing in the daylight. Their bodies were gaunt and twisted, their limbs unnaturally long. Their heads were elongated, with grotesque, hardened growths around their mouths, the source of that horrific clicking sound. They moved with a speed that belied their awkward appearance, their senses clearly heightened. They paused at the edge of the stream, their heads swiveling as if trying to pick up our scent. "Don't move," Silas breathed, his rifle raised. "Don't make a sound." We held our breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. The clickers moved closer to our hiding place, their clicking intensifying. One of them stopped just a few feet away, its eyeless gaze seemingly fixed on our location. The stench of decay wafted from it, sickeningly sweet and foul. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the clickers moved on, disappearing back into the dense undergrowth. We waited for several minutes, making sure they were truly gone before daring to move. "Damn things are fast," Silas muttered, his face grim. "And blind as bats, but they can hear everything." The encounter left us shaken, a stark reminder of the new level of threat we faced. The world had become even more dangerous. We continued our journey, our pace more hurried now, the fear of encountering more clickers spurring us onward. By late afternoon, we were exhausted and running low on water. Just as our spirits began to flag, Silas stopped again, a faint smile on his lips. "Look," he said, pointing through the trees. In the distance, nestled in a small clearing, we could see a cluster of cabins. Smoke curled lazily from a couple of chimneys. It was the logging camp. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. We had made it. We approached the camp cautiously, Silas leading the way. As we got closer, we could see people moving around, some tending to a small garden, others standing guard with makeshift weapons. A man with a weathered face and a shotgun approached us, his eyes wary. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice gruff. "We're survivors," Silas replied. "Just looking for shelter." The man studied us for a long moment, his gaze lingering on Emily and Thomas. Finally, he lowered his shotgun.
"Come on in,"
he said. "We've got room for a few more." As we walked into the logging camp, a sense of cautious optimism filled me. We had found a place, a community. Maybe, just maybe, this was where our luck would finally change. But even as I allowed myself a moment of hope, a chilling thought lingered in the back of my mind. We had survived the first 24 hours, and then some. We had faced the initial chaos, the hordes of the infected, and the terrifying new threat of the clickers. But the world had changed forever. There would be more dangers, more challenges ahead. Survival was a day by day struggle, a constant fight against the odds. And as I looked around at the faces of the other survivors, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and wariness, I knew that our journey was far from over. The nightmare had just evolved, and Jake, Razor, Riley, a man who had spent his life on the run, was now running for a different kind of survival in a world that had truly gone to hell. The Razor might have gotten me through the first few days, but only time would tell if it could keep me alive in the long run.